I watched from the kitchen window as Dad handed Sarah the keys to a brand new Honda Civic, complete with that new car smell and a red bow on the hood. At 23, my little sister was graduating college with a degree in art history and somehow deserved a celebration gift worth $25,000. The autumn leaves in our suburban Chicago neighborhood seemed to mock me as they fell, reminding me of all the times I'd raked them alone while Sarah painted her nails inside. Dad's proud smile stretched from ear to ear as he took photos of her, posing with the car, posting them immediately to Facebook with the caption, "So proud of my graduate." I gripped my coffee mug tighter, the ceramic handle threatening to crack under the pressure of my frustration. Mom bustled around the kitchen, preparing Sarah's favorite breakfast of blueberry pancakes and turkey bacon, the same breakfast she'd made every Sunday for the past 4 years since Sarah started college. The smell of maple syrup filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh flowers Dad had bought to celebrate the occasion. I remembered my own college graduation 3 years ago, when I'd received a handshake and a lecture about fiscal responsibility. The difference in treatment had always been there, but never this blatant, never this painful to witness. Sarah had always been the artistic one, the creative one, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. "Isn't it beautiful, Emma?" Mom called out, gesturing toward the window where Sarah was now taking selfies with her new car. Her voice carried that same tone of excitement she'd used when Sarah got into art school, the same tone that had been noticeably absent during my own achievements. I forced a smile and nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of resentment that had been building for years. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the yellow walls closing in on me as I watched my sister's celebration unfold. This was supposed to be a family moment, but I felt like an outsider looking in. My phone buzzed with notifications as Sarah's friends began commenting on her social media posts, each "congratulations" and "so jealous," adding salt to the wound. I scrolled through the comments, seeing names of people who barely knew Sarah but were quick to celebrate her success. Meanwhile, my own LinkedIn profile sat relatively quiet, despite the fact that I'd been promoted to senior analyst at my consulting firm just last month. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the one with the stable job, the one who'd been financially independent since graduation, yet I was the one watching from the sidelines. The notification sounds continued, each one a reminder of the attention. Sarah effortlessly commanded. Dad came back inside, his face flushed with excitement and pride, still clutching his phone to show anyone who'd listened the photos he'd taken. He immediately launched into a story about how he'd spent weeks researching the perfect car for Sarah, visiting multiple dealerships and negotiating the best price. The way he described the process, you'd think he was planning a military operation rather than buying a car. He'd even gotten the car detailed and the interior treated with some special protection package. I couldn't help but think about how different this story would have been if it were me asking for a car. "Emma, you should be proud of your sister," Mom said, placing a hand on my shoulder as she set down a plate of pancakes in front of me. The gesture felt condescending rather than comforting, like she was trying to manage my emotions instead of acknowledging them. I nodded again, cutting into the pancakes with more force than necessary, the syrup bleeding across the plate like my patience bleeding away. The pancakes tasted like cardboard in my mouth, every bite a reminder of the celebration I wasn't part of. Even the food seemed to be mocking me, too sweet and too perfect for this moment. Sarah bounced back into the house, her cheeks rosy from the cool October air, her excitement infectious to everyone except me. She immediately began planning road trips and weekend getaways, her voice filled with the kind of carefree joy that came from never having to worry about money or responsibility. Dad pulled out his credit card to set up her insurance, AAA membership, and emergency roadside assistance, treating each expense like it was pocket change. I calculated the total cost in my head, realizing it was more than I'd spent on myself in the past year combined. The casual way money flowed for Sarah's benefit stood in stark contrast to the lectures I'd received about every dollar I'd ever asked for. The conversation turned to Sarah's post-graduation plans, which seemed to involve a lot of finding herself and exploring her options rather than actual employment. Dad nodded approvingly at her artistic pursuits, encouraging her to take her time finding the right opportunity. I remembered how different the conversation had been after my graduation, when I'd been told I had 2 months to find a job or start paying rent. The double standard was so obvious it was almost laughable, except nothing about this situation felt funny. Sarah's future was painted in watercolors while mine had been drawn in black ink, permanent and unforgiving. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to get ready for a work meeting, though it was Saturday and I had no such appointment. Walking up the stairs to my childhood bedroom, I could hear Sarah's laughter echoing through the house, the sound following me like a ghost. The walls of my room were covered with academic achievement awards and honor roll certificates, faded reminders of accomplishments that had never earned me a car or a celebration. I sat on my bed, staring at my reflection in the dresser mirror, wondering when I'd become the responsible one who didn't deserve rewards. The person looking back at me seemed tired, older than my 28 years, worn down by years of being the sensible daughter. As I listened to the celebration continuing, downstairs I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my laptop and began researching car dealerships in the Chicago area, not to buy a car, but to understand how the business worked. If my family was going to treat me like I was invisible, maybe it was time to make myself impossible to ignore. The idea was crazy, impulsive, and completely unlike me, but something about Sarah's new car and my parents' obvious favoritism had awakened something I didn't know I had. I was done being the overlooked daughter, done being the one who had to earn everything while others received gifts, done being practical and responsible and ignored. Monday morning arrived with the crisp bite of autumn air and the sound of Sarah's new Honda starting up in the driveway. I watched from my bedroom window as she drove off to her first day at the gallery internship Dad had helped her secure through his business connections. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was still living at home to save money while she got to play artist with financial support. I'd moved back after college to pay off my student loans faster, a decision that had seemed practical at the time but now felt like a prison sentence. The walls of my childhood room seemed to close in a little more each day, decorated with reminders of the person I used to be before responsibility consumed my dreams. At breakfast, Dad was already dressed in his navy suit, ready for another day, at his insurance company where he'd worked for 20 years. Mom had laid out his usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, the morning routine so established it could run itself. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, comforting scents that today felt suffocating. I poured myself a cup of coffee and grabbed a granola bar, preferring to eat quickly and escape the domestic bliss that never seemed to include me. The morning light streaming through the windows highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, like tiny particles of my forgotten dreams. "Emma, we need to talk," Dad said, his voice taking on that serious tone I'd learned to dread over the years. He folded his newspaper neatly, a gesture that meant he was about to deliver one of his lectures about life and responsibility. Mom continued wiping down the already clean counters, her way of staying busy during uncomfortable conversations. I could feel the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same one I'd felt during every life lesson conversation since I was 16. The kitchen suddenly felt like a courtroom, and I was about to be sentenced for crimes I didn't understand. "I've been thinking about your living situation," he continued, his tone suggesting he'd been rehearsing this conversation. "You're 28 years old, Emma. You have a good job, a steady income, and you've been living at home for 3 years now." Each word hit like a carefully placed stone, building a wall between us that I could already see forming. Mom's wiping became more aggressive, the sound of the cloth against the counter creating a rhythm to accompany his speech. I gripped my coffee mug tighter, the ceramic warm against my palms, anchoring me to the moment I knew was about to change everything. "Sarah's different," he explained, as if I needed the comparison spelled out for me. "She's just starting her career, finding her path. You've been established for years now. The words, Sarah's different, echoed in my mind, confirming what I'd always suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. The favoritism wasn't subtle anymore. It was being served to me on a silver platter alongside my morning coffee. I watched his face as he spoke, noting the practiced way he delivered his reasoning, like he'd convinced himself this was fair and logical. The man who'd just bought his younger daughter a car was telling his older daughter she was too comfortable at home. I think it's time you started looking for your own place, he continued, his voice softening slightly, as if kindness would make the double standard less obvious. You need to spread your wings, become truly independent. The irony was suffocating. I was the one who'd never asked for money, never needed their help with anything, yet I was the one being pushed out of the nest. Mom finally stopped wiping and turned to face me, her expression apologetic but not surprised, like she'd known this conversation was coming. The kitchen that had been my refuge for 28 years suddenly felt foreign, like I was an intruder in someone else's home. I've already been looking at apartments, I lied, the words coming out steadier than I felt. I was planning to move out by the end of the month anyway. Dad's face brightened, probably relieved that I wasn't going to argue or cause a scene like I had in my teenage years. The truth was, I hadn't been looking at apartments because I'd been saving every penny, living frugally to build a nest egg for some future dream I hadn't even defined yet. Now that dream was being forced into reality, shaped by my parents' expectations, rather than my own timeline. The money I'd been saving would have to go toward rent and deposits, instead of whatever grand plan I'd been unconsciously developing. That's wonderful, Emma, Mom said, her voice carrying forced enthusiasm. Independence will be good for you. She said it like independence was a gift she was giving me, rather than an exile disguised as encouragement. The morning light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the kitchen floor, making the familiar space look different, alien. I finished my coffee in silence, tasting the bitterness that had nothing to do with the beans. This was the moment I realized I'd been playing by rules that were never meant for me, in a game where the scoring system changed based on who was playing. The drive to work felt different that morning, like I was seeing my life from the outside for the first time. The suburbs of Chicago looked more expensive than I'd remembered, each house representing a level of financial commitment I'd never considered seriously before. I passed the Honda dealership where Dad had bought Sarah's car, its bright flags, and shiny vehicles mocking me from behind the chain-link fence. The building looked smaller than I'd imagined, more achievable than the empire I'd built up in my mind. For the first time, I wondered what it would take to own something like that, to be the one with the power instead of the one being lectured. At my desk, I couldn't concentrate on the quarterly reports and client analyses that usually absorbed my attention. Instead, I found myself researching real estate prices, apartment listings, and gradually, almost without realizing it, business loans and franchise opportunities. The numbers swam in front of me, painting a picture of possibility I'd never considered before. My colleagues moved around me in their usual Monday morning fog, discussing weekend plans and quarterly projections, but I felt like I was operating on a different frequency. The seed of an idea that had been planted during Sarah's car celebration was beginning to grow, fed by the fertilizer of my father's lecture and my own mounting frustration with being invisible. That evening, I sat in my bedroom with my laptop, surrounded by printouts of business plans, franchise information, and financial spreadsheets that made my head spin. The soft glow of my desk lamp created a circle of light in the darkness, like I was conducting secret operations under cover of night. Below me, I could hear Sarah practicing her guitar, the melodic strumming drifting up through the floorboards along with the sound of my parents' muffled conversation. The house felt different now, like I was already halfway out the door, observing family life from a distance. My childhood poster of motivational quotes seemed to be mocking me from the wall, their simple wisdom inadequate for the complexity of my current situation. I'd spent hours researching the automotive industry, learning about inventory management, financing options, and customer service protocols. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how little I actually knew about running a business, especially one as complex as a car dealership. My background in financial analysis was helpful, but there were aspects of sales, marketing, and operations that were completely foreign to me. Each article I read revealed another layer of complexity, another skill I'd need to develop, another challenge I'd need to overcome. The romantic notion of buying a dealership out of spite was quickly being replaced by the harsh reality of what such a venture would actually entail. The Honda dealership where Dad had bought Sarah's car was called Riverside Honda, and according to their website, they'd been serving the Chicago area for over 30 years. The owner, a man named Frank Kowalski, had started with a small lot and built it into one of the most successful dealerships in the region. His biography read like a classic American success story, complete with humble beginnings and decades of hard work. I found myself studying his photo on the website, trying to understand what it took to build something from nothing. His smile was confident, but not arrogant, the kind of expression that suggested he'd earned his success through experience rather than luck. My phone buzzed with a text from my college friend Jessica, asking if I wanted to grab drinks after work. Tomorrow. The normalcy of the request felt strange in contrast to the radical thoughts swirling in my mind. I stared at the message for a long time before responding with a simple, "Sure," knowing that I'd probably spend the entire evening talking about apartment hunting instead of sharing my increasingly wild business fantasies. Jessica worked in marketing and had always been the practical one in our friendship, the voice of reason when I needed to be talked down from impulsive decisions. This time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be talked down. I opened a new spreadsheet and began calculating the financial requirements for purchasing a dealership, using the limited information I could find online. The numbers were staggering: initial investment, working capital, inventory costs, insurance, staffing, and dozens of other expenses I probably hadn't even considered. My savings account balance, which had seemed substantial for a 28-year-old, suddenly looked pathetic in comparison to what I'd need. Even if I could qualify for business loans, the personal financial risk would be enormous. The practical part of my brain was screaming warnings, but something deeper was pushing me forward. I found myself on the Honda corporate website, looking at their franchise requirements and application process. The language was dense and formal, filled with terms like market penetration analysis and capital adequacy ratios that made my head spin. Yet buried in the corporate speak, I could see the outline of a path forward, a series of steps that could theoretically lead from where I was to where I wanted to be. The application process alone would take months, assuming I could even meet their initial requirements. But knowing there was a process, that it was possible, made the idea feel less like a fantasy and more like a potential reality. The sound of Sarah's car pulling into the driveway interrupted my research, her headlights sweeping across my bedroom window as she parked. I could hear her talking on the phone as she walked to the house, her voice animated as she described her day at the gallery to some friend. The casual confidence in her voice, the assumption that people would be interested in her stories, reminded me of how different our worlds had become. She lived in a realm of artistic expression and parental support, while I was trapped in spreadsheets and lectures about responsibility. The contrast crystallized my determination to change the dynamic between us. I closed my laptop and lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling I'd been looking at for most of my life. The familiar water stain in the corner had grown slightly over the years, a slow-motion reminder of how time passed without dramatic change. Tomorrow, I'd have to return to my consulting job, analyzing other people's businesses and making recommendations I'd never have the courage to implement myself. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days helping companies optimize their operations while my own life felt completely unoptimized. Maybe it was time to take my own advice and make some strategic changes. My phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from LinkedIn about a connection request from someone in automotive sales. I accepted the request without thinking, then found myself scrolling through their profile, reading about their experience in the industry. The person had started as a sales associate and worked their way up to finance manager at a major dealership group. Their career progression looked achievable, rational, the kind of step-by-step advancement that made sense. But sense wasn't what I was looking for anymore. I wanted something that would make my parents notice, something that would prove I was more than just the responsible daughter. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear my parents discussing their finances in their bedroom down the hall, their voices carrying through the thin walls. They were talking about Sarah's insurance costs and some gallery event they wanted to attend to support her career. The casual way they discussed spending money on Sarah's behalf, after lecturing me about independence and financial responsibility, reinforced every decision I'd made that day. I fell asleep with numbers dancing in my head. Interest rates, inventory costs, and profit margins mixing with dreams of the look on my father's face when I told him I'd bought the dealership where he'd purchased Sarah's car. I called Riverside, Honda, on Tuesday morning, my hands trembling slightly as I dialed the number I'd memorized from their website. The receptionist answered with a cheerful voice, and I found myself asking to speak with Frank Kowalski about a potential business discussion. She put me on hold, and I listened to generic jazz music while my heart pounded in my chest. When Frank's voice came on the line, it was gravelly and warm, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd spent decades talking to customers. He seemed surprised but intrigued when I explained I was interested in learning about the automotive industry from an ownership perspective. "Well, that's not a conversation I have every day," he chuckled, and I could picture him leaning back in his office chair. "Tell you what, why don't you come by Thursday afternoon around 4? I've got some time before the evening rush, and I'm always happy to talk shop with someone who's serious about the business." His willingness to meet with a complete stranger spoke to either his generosity or his curiosity, and I suspected it was a bit of both. I confirmed the appointment and hung up, immediately second-guessing my decision to be so direct. But there was no turning back now. I'd committed to taking the first real step toward my impossible dream. Thursday arrived with an early winter chill that made me grateful for my wool coat as I drove to the dealership. The lot looked different in the late afternoon light, the rows of vehicles casting long shadows across the asphalt. I parked near the service entrance and walked toward the showroom, my heels clicking against the concrete with what I hoped sounded like confidence. The building was larger than it appeared from the street, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the newest models in pristine condition. Inside, the smell of new cars mixed with coffee and the sound of hushed conversations between sales staff and customers. Frank Kowalski was exactly what I'd expected, a man in his early 60s with silver hair, wearing a well-tailored suit that suggested success without being flashy. His handshake was firm, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that came from years of reading people and situations. His office was a testament to his time in the business, with photos of him, shaking hands with customers, awards from Honda Corporate, and a collection of model cars that spoke to genuine enthusiasm for the industry. The space felt lived in and comfortable, like this was a man who spent most of his waking hours here by choice rather than necessity. "So, Emma," he said, settling behind his desk with a cup of coffee, "tell me what brings you to my little corner of the automotive world." His tone was conversational but attentive, like he was genuinely interested in my story. I'd rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but sitting across from him, I found myself speaking more honestly than I'd planned. I told him about my background in financial analysis, my frustration with feeling invisible in my own family, and my growing interest in understanding how successful businesses were built. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, or making notes on a yellow legal pad. "That's quite a story," he said when I finished, his expression thoughtful. "I've been in this business for 35 years, and I can tell you it's not for the faint of heart. The hours are long, the competition is fierce, and the margins are thinner than most people think. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and opened it to reveal financial statements and operational reports. But it's also one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. Every car we sell represents someone's dream, someone's need, someone's next chapter. His passion was evident in the way he spoke about the business, and I found myself leaning forward, caught up in his enthusiasm. Frank walked me through the basics of dealership operations, from inventory management to customer financing, explaining each aspect with the patience of a teacher and the wisdom of experience. He showed me how they tracked everything from service appointments to parts orders, how they managed relationships with Honda Corporate, and how they navigated the complex world of automotive financing. The complexity was staggering, but so was the potential for success for someone who could master all the moving parts. Each system, he explained, revealed another layer of opportunity and challenge, painting a picture of a business that was equal parts art and science. The thing most people don't understand, he said, leaning back in his chair, is that this isn't really about selling cars. It's about solving problems and building relationships. Every customer who walks through that door has a story, a need, a situation that brought them here. He gestured toward the showroom floor where I could see a young couple examining a sedan, their faces serious as they discussed options. That couple might be buying their first car together, or replacing one that got totaled, or upgrading because they're expecting a baby. Our job is to understand their story and help them write the next chapter. As our conversation continued, I found myself asking more specific questions about the financial aspects of the business. Frank was surprisingly open about profit margins, inventory costs, and the relationship between new car sales and service revenue. He explained how the service department was often more profitable than sales, how financing generated additional income, and how building a loyal customer base was the key to long-term success. The numbers he shared were both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because they showed the business could be profitable, terrifying because they revealed how much capital was required to make it work. "I'll be honest with you, Emma," Frank said as our meeting began to wind down. "I'm thinking about retirement. Not tomorrow, not next year, but within the next 5 years. I've built something here that I'm proud of, but I don't have any children interested in taking over the business." He looked around his office with the expression of someone who loved what he'd built, but understood that everything had a season. "I've had corporate inquiries, offers from larger dealer groups, but I'd prefer to see this place go to someone who would maintain what we've built here. Someone who understands that this is about more than just moving inventory." The implications of his words hit me like a lightning bolt, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. As I drove home that evening, my mind was racing with possibilities I hadn't dared to consider seriously before. Frank's willingness to share information, his hints about future plans, and most importantly, his assessment that I had the analytical mind necessary for the business, had transformed my wild idea into something that felt achievable. The numbers were still daunting, the timeline was still years away, but for the first time, I could see a path from where I was to where I wanted to be. The evening traffic moved slowly around me, but I barely noticed, too caught up in imagining a future where I was the one sitting behind Frank's desk, solving problems and building relationships in my own automotive empire. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I had 2 missions: find an apartment to satisfy my father's expectations, and continue researching the automotive business to feed my growing ambition. The dichotomy between these 2 goals wasn't lost on me. One represented compromise and compliance, the other represented rebellion and risk. I made coffee and opened my laptop to browse apartment listings, but my mind kept drifting to Frank's words about retirement and succession planning. The possibility that Riverside Honda might be available in a few years had changed everything about my timeline and my approach. I spent my lunch break touring a studio apartment in Lincoln Park, a trendy neighborhood that would stretch my budget, but provide the kind of lifestyle Instagram posts were made of. The realtor, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled hair and an enthusiasm that felt practiced, showed me around the 600-square-foot space like it was a penthouse suite. The exposed brick walls and hardwood floors were undeniably charming, but the rent was nearly half my take-home pay. As she explained the amenities and neighborhood features, I found myself calculating how much less I'd be able to save each month, how much further it would push back any dreams of business ownership. This is perfect for a young professional. Like yourself, the realtor said, her voice suggesting that living in a glorified closet was somehow aspirational. The building has a rooftop deck and a fitness center, plus your walking distance to some of the best restaurants in the city. I nodded politely while mentally comparing the monthly rent to what I'd learned about dealership operating costs. The apartment felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to decide what kind of life I wanted to paint on it. That evening, I ordered pizza and spent hours setting up my home office in the corner of the bedroom. The desk faced the window, giving me a view of the city lights that stretched toward the horizon like a constellation of possibilities. I arranged my laptop, files, and the growing collection of automotive industry research I'd been accumulating. The space felt professional and purposeful, a command center for planning the next phase of my life. As I organized my materials, I realized that this apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was headquarters for my transformation from overlooked daughter to business owner. I called Frank the next Monday, ostensibly to thank him for his time, but really to maintain the connection I'd started building. He seemed genuinely pleased to hear from me and asked how my research was progressing. I told him about the apartment, the move, and my continued interest in the automotive industry. He listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like my plans were legitimate rather than fantasy. When I mentioned that I was looking into business school programs to strengthen my background, he surprised me by offering to let me shadow him occasionally to get real-world experience. The offer felt like a gift and a challenge wrapped into one. The best education in this business comes from being here, watching how it all works together, he said, his voice warm with the enthusiasm of someone who loved teaching. I've got a good relationship with the local business school, and I've mentored a few students over the years. If you're serious about learning the industry, I'd be happy to show you the ropes. His willingness to invest time in my education felt like validation of my potential, proof that my interest was being taken seriously by someone who mattered. I accepted his offer immediately, probably too eagerly, but I didn't care about appearing desperate. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I needed. My first day shadowing Frank was a Tuesday in December, and I arrived at the dealership early, dressed in my most professional outfit and carrying a notebook like I was reporting for a new job. The morning was busy with customers picking up cars from service and sales staff preparing for the day ahead. Frank introduced me to his team as someone interested in learning the business, and I was struck by how respectful and welcoming everyone was. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed, like a family business where everyone knew their role and took pride in their work. I could see why Frank had been successful. He'd created a culture that valued both performance and relationships. The first thing I learned was that running a dealership was like conducting an orchestra where every section played a different song. Frank walked me through the sales floor during the morning rush, explaining how the sales consultants worked with customers, how financing was structured, and how trade-ins were evaluated. Each transaction involved multiple people and systems, from the initial greeting to the final paperwork, and I was amazed by how seamlessly everything flowed together. The complexity was daunting, but I could see the logic behind every process, the way each step was designed to maximize both customer satisfaction and profitability. Watching the team work, I realized that success in this business required mastering dozens of different skills simultaneously. In the service department, I met Maria, the service manager who'd been with the dealership for 15 years. She explained how service revenue often exceeded sales revenue, especially during slower months when fewer people were buying cars. The service bays were organized with military precision, each technician working on multiple vehicles throughout. the day, and Maria orchestrated the entire operation from her desk overlooking the floor. She showed me how they tracked everything from oil changes to major repairs, how they managed warranty claims, and how they built relationships with customers that lasted for years. Her expertise was evident in every decision she made, and I realized that finding people like Maria would be crucial to any future success I might have. Frank let me sit in on a few sales meetings, and I was fascinated by the psychology involved in helping customers make decisions. The best salespeople weren't pushy or aggressive. They were consultants who listened carefully and matched customers with vehicles that met their needs and budgets. I watched a young salesman named Carlos work with a family buying their first minivan, and the patience he showed in explaining features and financing options was impressive. He treated their purchase like it was the most important sale of his career, even though it was probably one of dozens he'd handle that month. The genuine care he showed for their experience made me understand why Frank's dealership had such a strong reputation. The financial side of the business was where my background became most relevant, and Frank spent considerable time explaining how dealerships made money beyond just selling cars. Extended warranties, financing arrangements, service contracts, and accessories all contributed to the bottom line in ways that most customers never realized. He showed me monthly financial statements that revealed the true complexity of the business, with revenue streams I'd never considered and expenses that would make most people's heads spin. The margins were thinner than I'd expected, but the volume was substantial, and I began to understand how the business could be both challenging and profitable for someone who managed it well. During one of my visits, a customer complained loudly about a service experience, and I watched Frank handle the situation with a combination of empathy and business acumen that was masterful. He listened to the customer's concerns without interrupting, acknowledged their frustration, and then worked with Maria to find a solution that satisfied everyone involved. The customer left happy, and Frank used the incident as a teaching moment about the importance of customer service in building long-term relationships. His handling of the situation showed me that successful business ownership required emotional intelligence as much as financial acumen. I began spending time at the dealership every Tuesday and Thursday evening, arriving after my regular job and staying until closing time. The evening hours were different from the daytime rush, with fewer customers but more administrative work. I helped with inventory counts, learned about ordering systems, and watched how the team prepared for the next day's activities. Frank seemed to enjoy having someone to explain things to, and our conversations often extended beyond business topics to include his philosophy about work, success, and building something meaningful. These evening discussions became the highlight of my week, feeding my growing confidence that I could eventually succeed in this industry. The more time I spent at the dealership, the more I realized how much I didn't know about the automotive industry. The relationship with Honda Corporate was complex, involving monthly sales targets, inventory requirements, and marketing support that had to be carefully managed. Frank explained how manufacturer incentives worked, how allocation of popular models was determined, and how dealerships competed not just with each other, but with other brands for customer attention. The business was far more sophisticated than I'd imagined, but that complexity also represented opportunity for someone willing to master all the moving parts. One evening in January, Frank and I were reviewing the year-end financial statements when he looked up from the paperwork and asked, "Emma, what do you really want to do with your life?" The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so direct, and partly because I'd been asking myself the same thing for months. I found myself telling him about my frustration with being overlooked, my desire to build something meaningful, and my growing belief that I could succeed in the automotive industry. He listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, and I realized I was having the most honest conversation about my future that I'd had with anyone. "I think you have what it takes," he said when I finished, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people's potential. "You understand numbers, you ask good questions, and you're not afraid of hard work. But owning a dealership isn't just about business skills. It's about leadership, about building relationships, about being responsible for other people's livelihoods. His assessment felt like both encouragement and warning, acknowledging my potential while making sure I understood the magnitude of what I was considering. The conversation ended with him suggesting I start thinking seriously about my timeline and my financing options. That night, I drove home through the quiet streets of Chicago, my mind racing with possibilities and calculations. The dealership's lights were still on in my rearview mirror, and I could see the outline of Frank's office where he was probably finishing paperwork or planning the next day's activities. 6 months ago, I'd been the invisible daughter living at home and feeling sorry for myself. Now I was learning a business that could potentially change my entire life trajectory. The transformation felt both gradual and sudden, like I'd been slowly building momentum that was finally starting to show results. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than away from something. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came news that would change everything. Frank called me on a Tuesday morning while I was at my regular job, his voice carrying an excitement I'd never heard before. Honda Corporate had approached him about expanding his operation to include a second location, a struggling dealership in a nearby suburb that needed new management. The opportunity was significant, but would require a substantial investment and Frank's personal guarantee on additional financing. As he explained the details, I found myself holding my breath, sensing that this conversation would somehow affect my own future plans. "The thing is, Emma," Frank continued, "I'm not sure I want to take on that kind of expansion at this stage of my career. The numbers work, but it would mean another 5 to 10 years of intensive management, and I'd been hoping to start stepping back." He paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers in his office. It got me thinking about our conversations regarding succession planning. What if, instead of expanding, I started looking for someone to gradually take over the current operation? The implications of his words hit me like a lightning bolt, and I had to sit down at my desk to process what he was suggesting. We arranged to meet that evening to discuss the possibility in detail, and I spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous excitement that made it impossible to concentrate on my regular work. My colleagues probably thought I was having a medical emergency, given how distracted and jittery I appeared. I kept replaying Frank's words, trying to understand exactly what he was proposing and whether I was ready for such a massive opportunity. The timeline I'd been imagining in terms of years was suddenly condensing into months, and I wasn't sure if I was terrified or thrilled by the acceleration. That evening, Frank laid out a proposal that was both generous and challenging. He suggested a gradual transition over 2 years, during which I would work at the dealership full-time while learning every aspect of the operation. He would handle the major decisions and customer relationships while I focused on operations, finance, and building my own expertise. At the end of the 2 years, assuming everything went well, he would sell me the business with owner financing that would make the purchase feasible for someone with my limited capital. The arrangement would allow him to retire gradually while ensuring the dealership's continued success. "I've been watching you for months," Frank explained, "and I think you have the right combination of analytical skills and people sense to succeed in this business. You ask good questions, you're not afraid of hard work, and you understand that success comes from building relationships rather than just moving inventory." His confidence in my abilities felt both validating and terrifying. I'd spent so long being the overlooked daughter that having someone believe in my potential was almost overwhelming. The opportunity he was offering was everything I'd been dreaming about, but it was also a massive leap from my current life. The financial structure he proposed was creative and fair, with a purchase price based on the dealership's average earnings over the previous 3 years. The down payment would be substantial but manageable given my savings, and the remaining balance would be paid over 10 years with interest rates that reflected our personal relationship rather than commercial lending standards. Frank would retain a small ownership stake and serve as a consultant for the first few years, providing guidance and continuity for customers and staff. The arrangement addressed my concerns about financing while giving him the security of ongoing income and involvement. Asked for a week to consider the proposal, though I knew I'd already made my decision before leaving his office that night. The opportunity was exactly what I'd been hoping for, but it would require me to leave my current job, commit to a completely different career path, and take on financial obligations that would affect the rest of my life. The responsible part of my brain was screaming warnings about risk and prudence, but the part that had been frustrated and overlooked for years was shouting encouragement. This was my chance to build something meaningful, to prove that I was capable of more than anyone had imagined. I spent the next few days researching similar business transitions, consulting with an attorney about the legal implications, and running financial projections until my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. Every analysis I conducted suggested that Frank's proposal was fair and potentially profitable, assuming I could successfully manage the transition and maintain the dealership's current performance. The numbers were encouraging, but I knew that success would depend on factors that couldn't be quantified. My ability to lead people, build relationships, and navigate the countless challenges that would arise. The conversation with my parents was scheduled for Sunday dinner, and I approached it with the same preparation I'd use for a business presentation. I'd prepared financial projections, researched the automotive industry, and practiced explaining why this opportunity made sense for my career. I expected skepticism, concern, and probably some lectures about responsibility and risk. What I didn't expect was the complete silence that followed my announcement. Dad put down his fork and stared at me like I'd told him I was joining a circus, while Mom looked confused and slightly hurt that I hadn't consulted them earlier. "Emma, this is a huge decision," Dad finally said, his voice carrying the tone he'd used when I was 16 and had crashed his car. "You're talking about leaving a stable job with benefits to buy a business you know nothing about. The risk is enormous, and if it fails, you'll be starting over at 30 with nothing but debt." His concerns were valid and echoed the voice of doubt in my own head, but they also reinforced my determination to prove that I was capable of success. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet during dinner, suddenly spoke up with a comment that crystallized everything I'd been feeling for months. "At least Emma's doing something interesting for once." I gave my 2 weeks' notice at the consulting firm on a Monday morning in May, and my supervisor's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. A mixture of surprise, concern, and barely concealed judgment about my career choices. She spent 20 minutes explaining all the reasons why leaving a stable corporate job to buy a car dealership was a mistake, as if I hadn't spent months analyzing every aspect of the decision. Her lecture reminded me of my father's reactions. Over the years, the assumption that my judgment couldn't be trusted and that I needed protection from my own poor decisions. Walking out of that office for the last time felt like shedding a skin that had never quite fit properly. My first day as Frank's full-time business partner was both exciting and terrifying. He'd cleared out the office next to his for me, and I spent the morning setting up my desk and familiarizing myself with the dealership's systems. The learning curve was steep: inventory management software, customer relationship databases, and financial reporting systems that were more complex than anything I'd used in consulting. But I was determined to master every aspect of the operation, and I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Frank. Every process I learned, every relationship I built, every challenge I overcame was a step toward owning something that was truly mine. The staff's reaction to my transition from observer to colleague was mixed but generally positive. Maria, the service manager, became an invaluable mentor, sharing decades of experience in managing both people and operations. Carlos, the young salesman I'd watched work with customers, took pride in teaching me about the sales process and customer psychology. Some of the older employees were skeptical about my background and my intentions, But they respected Frank's judgment and were willing to give me a chance to prove myself. I knew that earning their trust would be crucial to my long-term success, and I worked hard to show that I valued their expertise and contributions. The first major challenge came in July when Honda Corporate announced changes to their incentive programs that would significantly impact our profitability. Frank let me take the lead on analyzing the implications and developing our response strategy. I spent sleepless nights running financial models and researching how other dealerships were adapting to the changes. The solution I proposed involved adjusting our inventory mix, modifying our sales approach, and implementing new marketing strategies that would maintain our profit margins while remaining competitive. When Honda's regional manager visited and complimented our adaptation strategy, I felt a pride and validation I'd never experienced in my previous career. By August, I was handling most of the day-to-day operations while Frank focused on major strategic decisions and key customer relationships. The transition was gradual but steady, with Frank gradually transferring responsibilities as I demonstrated competence in each area. I was working 60-hour weeks and loving every minute of it, energized by the challenge and the sense of building something meaningful. The contrast with my previous job was stark. Instead of analyzing other people's businesses, I was actively building and improving my own. Every decision I made, every problem I solved, every relationship I built was an investment in my own future. The financial performance under my increased involvement was encouraging. We exceeded our sales targets for 3 consecutive months, and customer satisfaction scores reached the highest levels in the dealership's history. I'd implemented several operational improvements based on my consulting background, streamlining processes and improving efficiency without sacrificing quality. Frank was impressed with the results and increasingly confident in my ability to eventually take over the entire operation. Our evening conversations had evolved from mentoring sessions to strategic planning meetings where we discussed the business as equals. The personal transformation was as significant as the professional one. I'd moved from my small apartment to a larger place closer to the dealership, furnished it with confidence rather than frugality, and started dressing like someone who owned a business rather than someone who worked for someone else. The change was subtle but noticeable. I carried myself differently, spoke with more authority, and approached challenges with confidence rather than anxiety. People at the dealership had started coming to me with questions and problems, treating me as a leader rather than a trainee. The respect felt earned rather than given, which made it infinitely more valuable. The most satisfying moment came in September when Sarah visited the dealership for the first time. She'd been curious about my career change but hadn't taken it seriously until she saw me in action. I was in the middle of handling a complex customer situation when she arrived, and she watched me navigate the problem with the same patient professionalism I'd learned from Frank. After the customer left satisfied, Sarah looked around the showroom and service area with new eyes, seeing not just a car dealership, but a complex business operation that I was successfully managing. Her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine respect, and I realized that I'd finally done something that made me impossible to overlook. "I had no idea it was like this," she said as I showed her around the facility. "I thought you just sold cars to people, but this is like running a small corporation." Her acknowledgement meant more to me than any family celebration or parental approval, because it came from someone who'd finally seen me as I really was, rather than as the responsible daughter who lived in the background. The visit lasted 2 hours, and by the end, she was asking detailed questions about my plans and expressing genuine admiration for what I'd accomplished. For the first time in our lives, I felt like we were relating as equals rather than as the favorite daughter and the overlooked one. That evening, Frank and I reviewed the month's performance over dinner at a restaurant near the dealership. The numbers were strong, the team was performing well, and our customer satisfaction scores continued to climb. As we discussed plans for the following year, Frank smiled and said, "Emma, I think you're ready to start thinking about ownership rather than partnership." The transition is going better than I'd hoped, and I'm more confident than ever that you're the right person to take over this business." His words felt like a graduation ceremony, a formal recognition that I'd successfully transformed from frustrated daughter to competent business leader. The journey from Sarah's car celebration to this moment had taken less than 2 years, but it felt like a lifetime of growth and achievement. The paperwork for purchasing Riverside Honda was finalized on a crisp October morning, exactly 18 months after I'd first walked into Frank's office as a curious visitor. The closing took place in a conference room at the bank, with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors surrounding a table covered with documents that represented the culmination of my transformation. Frank sat across from me, his expression mixing pride and nostalgia as he prepared to transfer ownership of the business he'd built over 3 decades. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on either of us. This was more than a business transaction. It was the passing of a legacy from one generation to the next. As I signed each document, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been the invisible daughter living at home, watching my sister receive gifts and celebration while I received lectures about responsibility. The woman signing these papers was someone I'd never imagined I could become, confident, successful, and finally in control of her own destiny. The pen felt heavy in my hand, each signature a commitment to a future I was building rather than accepting. Frank watched me sign with the expression of a proud father, and I realized that he'd given me something my own parents never had: complete faith in my abilities. The financial commitment was substantial but manageable, thanks to the creative structure Frank had developed and my aggressive saving over the previous 2 years. The down payment represented most of my savings, but I'd been preparing for this moment since our first serious conversation about succession planning. The monthly payments would be significant, but were covered by the dealership's consistent profitability, and I'd built additional reserves to handle unexpected challenges. Looking at the numbers on the loan documents, I felt a mixture of excitement and responsibility that was both thrilling and sobering. This wasn't just buying a business. It was betting on myself in the most comprehensive way possible. After the paperwork was complete, Frank and I walked through the dealership together one last time as owner and successor. He introduced me to customers and vendors as the new owner, his voice carrying genuine pride in what we'd accomplished together. The staff had known this day was coming, but seeing it actually happen created a mixture of excitement and nervousness that was palpable. Throughout the building, Maria hugged me and said, "You've earned this, Emma." Frank chose well. Carlos shook my hand with the respect of someone who'd watched me grow from curious observer to competent leader. Their acceptance and support felt like the final validation of my transformation. The first week of ownership was a whirlwind of challenges and decisions that tested everything I'd learned during the transition period. A major customer had a problem with their vehicle that required delicate handling. Honda Corporate needed updated paperwork reflecting the ownership change, and 2 employees gave notice on the same day for unrelated reasons. Each crisis was an opportunity to demonstrate my leadership and problem-solving abilities, and I handled them with the confidence Frank had helped me develop. By Friday, I was exhausted, but exhilarated, finally understanding the difference between working in a business and owning one. The family dinner celebrating my purchase was a study in contrasts with Sarah's car celebration 2 years earlier. This time, I was the one receiving congratulations and expressions of pride, though the tone was more subdued and respectful than celebratory. Dad seemed genuinely impressed by what I'd accomplished, his questions about the business revealing a new respect for my judgment and capabilities. Mom was proud, but clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd undertaken, asking practical questions about insurance and security that reflected her maternal concerns. Sarah was openly admiring, asking about my plans and expressing genuine interest in my success. The conversation felt like a formal recognition that I'd finally stepped out of the shadows and into my own light. The most satisfying moment came when Dad asked to visit the dealership to see what I'd purchased. I gave him the full tour, explaining our operations, introducing him to key staff members, and showing him the financial performance under my management. He asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to my answers, treating me as a business peer rather than his daughter who needed guidance. When we reached my office, he looked around at the awards on the walls, the photos with customers, and the organized chaos of running a successful business. "Emma," he said, "I owe you an apology. I never realized you had this kind of vision and capability. What you've accomplished here is remarkable." His acknowledgement felt like the final piece of validation I'd been seeking. 3 months into ownership, I received a call from a reporter at the local business journal who wanted to write a story about young entrepreneurs in the automotive industry. The interview lasted an hour, and the resulting article was titled, "From Consulting to Car Sales: How One Woman Built Her Dream Business." Reading my story in print, complete with a photo of me standing in front of the dealership, felt surreal and satisfying. The article mentioned my rapid transition from employee to owner, the improvements I'd made to operations, and the dealership's continued success under new management. Seeing my accomplishments recognized in print felt like proof that my journey was real and significant. The success of the business exceeded even my optimistic projections. Within 6 months of ownership, we'd expanded our service hours, hired additional staff, and achieved the highest customer satisfaction scores in the Honda regional network. The financial performance was strong enough to allow me to begin exploring opportunities for growth, including the possibility of adding a second location or expanding into related services. Frank remained available as a consultant, but I found myself needing his guidance less frequently as my confidence and expertise grew. The transition from employee to owner was complete, but the journey of building something meaningful was just beginning. As I locked up the dealership on a Friday evening in December, I reflected on the transformation that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been the overlooked daughter, frustrated by my family's favoritism and my own perceived limitations. Tonight, I was the owner of a successful business, employing 15 people and serving hundreds of customers throughout the region. The journey from Sarah's car celebration to this moment had been challenging, risky, and occasionally terrifying, but it had also been the most rewarding experience of my life. I'd proven to myself and everyone else that I was capable of far more than anyone had imagined, including myself. The Honda Civic that had started this entire journey was still in my parents' driveway, a daily reminder of the favoritism that had once frustrated me so deeply. But now when I saw it, I smiled rather than felt angry, because it had been the catalyst for the most important decision of my life. Sarah's car had received a red bow and a Facebook post. My business had received a feature article and recognition as one of the region's most successful young entrepreneurs. The comparison no longer bothered me because I'd finally built something that was entirely my own, something that couldn't be given or taken away by anyone else. I'd transformed from the daughter who got lectures into the woman who got results, and that transformation had been worth every challenge along the way.